So now we're going to move to a new topic. This weekend in Washington, starting on Friday, there's going to be a series of events, anti-war events. March on the Pentagon is the rubric under which they take place. Tomorrow there will be a meeting, a rally at the White House at 11 a.m. And then the protesters will march to the Washington Post, where they will begin, they will be protesting Jeff Bezos's role in promoting war. And here with us to discuss all of this is Brian Becker. Brian is, of course, the host of the Sputnik show, Loud and Clear. He's been a long-time leading member of the Answer Coalition. He has a long history of organizing anti-war demonstrations. And what we want to talk about is not only this weekend's events that began this morning on Friday, but also the history of anti-war movements and where we're at today. Brian, thanks a lot for joining us on Live.
Hey, Joe, my pleasure.
Okay, let's go back in time, if you don't mind, spending a little history. We do long-form, in-depth journalism here, so if you've got the time, I want to talk about the history of this. Now, we can go back to the first war that the United States fought, which was of independence against Britain, and while there were Tories who opposed that, they were spying and whatnot. Of course, there were no such protests against the American Revolution that I'm aware of, nor were there Americans, if there were any, who opposed a war against Britain. We have to go, I think, fast forward to the Civil War and the draft riots in New York, but I don't think you're going to see that as exactly an anti-war movement in the vein of, let's say, Vietnam, do you?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there's different trends and tendencies within the anti-war movement. There always have been. There is a pacifist wing of the anti-war movement, which believes that war and violence must be opposed under all circumstances. There were pacifists who were involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam, such as Dave Dellinger, who actually went to prison during World War II because, based on political or religious convictions, they opposed any application of violence, even in World War II, even when the United States was at war with Nazi Germany and Japan. In the case of the Civil War, the anti-draft riots in the North were basically the pro-slavery wing of northern cities, and that wasn't small, who didn't want to fight in the Civil War because they actually believed in the existing status quo of slavery. Of course, during the Civil War, rich people in the North could buy their way out of service, and so there was an element of class indignation to the anti-draft riots. The fact that your class station in life allowed you to exit the danger of war. But more or less, those anti-draft riots were racist riots. They were anti-Black riots. Again, coming back to the pacifist wing of the movement, when I was a teenager, I became involved in the war against the war that the U.S. was waging against Vietnam. A lot of people were pacifists. I was never amongst them. I never had the feeling that violence was, under all circumstances, unjustified. In fact, I would have proud to have been served in the Yankee Union Army in the North against the system of slavery. And I grew up in a family that was very against the war in Vietnam, but very pro the war against Southern slavery. And so I've always, through my whole life, been a part of the anti-war movement that was not pacifist and not against violence under all circumstances, but anti-imperialist. And of course, the anti-imperialist wing of the Vietnam anti-war movement became, as you know, Joe, a very profound part of American politics. But in a larger sense, there developed what was called the Vietnam syndrome, that strange illness, that strange malady whereby the majority of Americans thought it was stupid, wrong, a waste, or morally reprehensible for the U.S. to send its young men and women thousands of miles away to countries they didn't know about to wage wars against those people. And the Vietnam syndrome that developed a profound anti-war mass sentiment in the United States acted for a while as something of a constraint on US war makers. And as a matter of fact, when George H.W. Bush ran to the microphone at the conclusion of that 42-day long Gulf War that started on January 16th, 1991, the first Gulf War, the first war against Iraq, the first thing he said is the Vietnam syndrome is over, meaning the government elites could now sort of get past Vietnam in this big, broad anti-war sentiment that had functioned as a restraint on policymakers. But that anti-war sentiment that existed in the United States, it had different, the Vietnam syndrome, it had, yes, the anti-imperialist wing, which I was part of. There was also the anti-war wing that wasn't truly anti-imperialist, that thought of the war as a mistake, as the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time. The George McGoverns of the 1960s and early 70s, of course, McGovern ran for president against Nixon in 1972. He ran on an anti-war program, but his program was like, this is the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time, meaning the US should focus more on the Middle East, where 2/3 of the world's oil was, and which was raging at that time with the possibility of anti-imperialist revolution. So those of us who were the anti-imperialists in the anti-war movement basically were organizing against what we might call the liberal imperialists, who saw Vietnam as the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time, and thought that the military should be situated elsewhere, which was more important. And we can see from the ultimate defeat in Vietnam, imperialism did not collapse. The US, quote, lost Vietnam, it lost Cambodia, it lost Laos. But 25 years later, the US began trade relations with Vietnam. It has friendly relations with Vietnam now. It's courting Vietnam to become part of an anti-China bloc. I don't think that will be successful, but that's what they're doing. And so the imperialists who were against that war maybe were right from a strategic point of view that the war in Vietnam was a bad war at the wrong place at the wrong time. And mainly that was motivated, I'd say, from their point of view, because the US could not win the war in Vietnam. And the war in Vietnam incrementally dragged the United States into a conflict that it could not win, nor would any politician take responsibility for exiting the war and thus accepting responsibility for its defeat, until Richard Nixon was finally compelled to do so when he had won re-election for a second term and knew he didn't have to run once again.
So just to finish up on the historical background, in the First World War, we saw rallies, Eugene Debs, for example, against the war. He was imprisoned under the Sedition Act, which was part of the Espionage Act, for those remarks. We saw before the Second World War in the 1930s, students marching in some cities aligned with labor against fascism and against the war. So there's been this thread of anti-war movements throughout US history, including Quakers, as you mentioned, who were pacifists, etc., and other pacifists. But it was really the Vietnam War protests that you've just been talking about that it created the model of massive street demonstrations. And you're absolutely correct to be pointing out that George H.W. Bush, that war was fought in many ways to be able to allow American militarists to act more freely. They were back on the back foot after the collapse, the loss in Vietnam, which was an enormous shame and defeat for them, to lose to essentially a third world country, in some cases using bows and arrows against American threats of nuclear war. And they lost that war in Vietnam. And that became, again, the model to protest. And when Bush had to, there was no full-scale invasion of another country until that 1991 war. And by the way, they also embedded journalists for the first time there, because the press had been a huge issue in the Vietnam War for its freedom in reporting and bringing home to American homes. I remember as a kid watching on TV, bleeding Americans on stretchers being put into helicopters, and that was put an end to also in that 1999 war. So that started the template for the wars we've had since, the way the press is controlled. But the anti-war movement has not gone away. I remember a huge demonstration before that 1991 War, Mark, in New York that I went to. And then, of course, in 2003, before the U.S. invasion of Iraq's second Gulf War, there were the largest demonstrations in human history, millions in many, many cities around the world. I frankly was surprised by that. I was covering that story, and I was shocked about the size of it. Maybe you weren't. You were involved in organizing those here in the U.S. Has the Vietnam syndrome still been kicked? Or did that demonstration in 2003 and 1991 show that there's still, with U.S. people still have it within them to get out on the streets massively to protest a war?
Those are interesting and important questions. I was a central organizer in the large protests you went to in New York before the first Gulf War, and I was the principal organizer, the permit holder, in fact, for the mass protests in Washington, D.C. in 2000, starting October 26, 2002, and then January 18th, 2003. We had 500,000 here on the Capitol. February 15th, 2003, all around the world, including at that time, New York. Then March 15th, 4 days before the war started, we had another 100,000 here in Washington. So I was there. I was like right in the center of all of that. And I can remember doing, and by the way, at that time we also had access to mainstream media. The internet was a new thing in 2003 for anti-war organizing. That didn't really exist in 1991. So we were able. That's part of the reason it became such a massive movement all around the world and unprecedented. The New York Times called it the second global superpower after the March 15, 2003 demo, when what the estimate was 10 million people participated in demonstrations around the world that day. So we were all working together, and because we were communicating with each other. Even in the smallest Eskimo village of indigenous people in Alaska, they held demonstration on February 15th. I mean, it was amazing. And we sort of had the wind in our sails. But Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice, they were racing to go to war with Iraq, mainly because the momentum of our side was so great. It's not true. It's a historical rewrite that the American people fell hook, line, and sinker for the propaganda that Iraq must be targeted because it had weapons of mass destruction. That's not true. That's a lie. As a matter of fact, not only were we having mass demos every month, literally month after month, hundreds of thousands of people, the calls coming into congressional offices were running about 300 to 1 against the U.S. going to war in Iraq. So it was a massive opposition. But they raced to war because the calculation of the war makers was once the war began, the anti-war sentiment would subside, because then Americans at the moment of the outbreak of hostilities, Americans would be less likely to protest, because then they'd be like turning their back on their fellow Americans who were giving their lives in a shooting war. And you could see that once the war started, the level of anti-war activity went way down. I mean, I know it because I was living this every day. And suddenly the sort of the war fever took over. And then, unlike Vietnam, which was a protracted conflict where the US could, as we said in the beginning, incrementally kept losing, but couldn't leave. And so the anti-war sentiment sort of grew and grew and grew, and then had that explosion where the quantity of anti-war momentum of sentiment was so profound that it became the majority sentiment. The goal of these war makers, with all of that in mind, with Vietnam in mind, was go to war, take advantage of the immediate war fever that exists at the beginning of every war. You know, World War I, World War II, at the beginning, all sides, there's a war fever. And the ruling classes always successfully takes the masses of people into war at the moment the conflict begins. And then to end the war as quickly as possible. So that was why Bush and Cheney and all of them decided to use this concept of a lightning speed invasion of Iraq. Remember, it was a light footprint. It was 150,000 troops, not like 450,000 that were deployed in the 1991 war. They landed in Kuwait. They raced through the desert. They were moving at super fast pace, and they seized Baghdad. And when they seized Baghdad, they could arrange all of the optics, again, with embedded reporters this time, as you were mentioning about the first Gulf War too, so that they organized the statue of Saddam being pulled down by people in the middle of downtown Baghdad. Well, most of those people pulling the statue down lived in Detroit. You know, they lived in the Iraqi American community from Michigan. A lot of people had been brought over as part of this regime change operation. And it looked like Bush won. Bush was successful. The war was over, a victory. And all of the anti-war sentiment melted away. And the ruling class in America and all the media started to congratulate Bush for having done it. Like before the war, they were worried it would be like Vietnam, but because he could end the war in 3 weeks, disperse the Saddam government, he won.
Mission accomplished. Mission accomplished.
And he actually went on an aircraft carrier, the Abraham Lincoln, which was docked in San Diego. They pulled the damn aircraft carrier out to the ocean, flew Bush on a helicopter onto the thing, and then dragged it back into port so that he could be giving a speech with his flak jacket on underneath a big banner that read "Mission Accomplished." So it was like this complete lying sort of operation. And for a moment, Bush was congratulated. And Joe, I was, again, the principal organizer of a demonstration that happened 3 days after the fall of Baghdad. And it was August 12th, April 12th, 2003. And where we had 100,000 on March 15th and 500,000 on January 18th, our demonstration on April 12th was 30,000. So you could see the tremendous diminution of the movement because Bush won, because he could claim victory. And we had our banner change. We said, occupation is not liberation. And the Answer Coalition, which represented, again, the more left-wing, more anti-imperialist part of the anti-war movement, we made the announcement in Freedom Plaza here in Washington, D.C., that this victory would be short-lived, that the Iraqi people would not live under occupation peacefully. We predicted that there would be a large-scale guerrilla resistance, and that this would turn into Vietnam. And like very few people joined us. Again, 100,000 on March 15th, only 30,000 April 12th. So it turned out, as we all know the rest of the story, the resistance in Iraq grew and grew and grew. People in Fallujah were having peaceful demonstrations because right then in 2003, because while some of them welcomed the overthrow of Saddam, the American soldiers occupied their school and used it as their living quarters, their elementary school in Fallujah. And the parents were angry that their kids couldn't go to school, so they started to have protests and said, give us our school back. And at a certain point, the Marines opened fire on them and shot a whole bunch of parents dead. And that's how Fallujah resistance began. You know, all over Iraq, you know, what later became ISIS, you know, basically rooted in Sunni communities who had lost political power and who were treated so brutally by American military occupation forces and sectarian militias that had been the allies of the Americans, mostly Shiite militias, in the de-Baathification of the army, meaning 100,000 soldiers couldn't work anymore. They had no livelihood and the country was occupied. They became the human material who became ISIS. They didn't all start off as, theological zealots. And of course, finally, the resistance grew and grew. And on September 24th, 2005, Answer Coalition and another large anti-war coalition called United for Peace and Justice, we formed the United Front And on September 24th, 2005, we had a demonstration of 350,000 people here in Washington. So while we were 30,000 on April 12th, right after the fall of Baghdad, 2 years later, the movement came back because the resistance in Iraq made it impossible for the Americans to secure a peaceful puppet regime in Iraq. So it had the feelings of Vietnam once again. And, you know, ultimately, Obama got elected on the basis of promising that he was going to end the war in Iraq. That was very popular. And then ISIS, you know, came into existence, had come into existence. Al-Qaeda and the alienated Sunni communities became the human materiel for ISIS. And they became a military force aided by many other factors. I don't want to talk about it too much, but that compelled Obama to send troops back to Iraq and begin bombing Iraq once again. That was starting in September 2014. And then when Trump ran, and you will remember this, he kept saying, why are we in all these endless wars? Why I was against Iraq war, which I don't think he was telling the truth. But, you know, nonetheless, the base of Trump supporters, like the base of the Democratic Party supporters, they don't want these wars. They don't want endless war. I mean, whose kids get sent to Iraq? Whose kids are in Afghanistan? It's not, you know, there are some of the elites who have their kids in military operations, but not many. It's mainly working class and poor people. So again, the anti-war sentiment, it has a generic foundational element that endures. And it's not simply left-wing or right-wing, and it's certainly not simply anti-imperialist or something else. It's because largely human beings loathe the idea of war, especially if they or their families are involved in them.
So I take your answer to be the Vietnam syndrome is not over. And we saw those Vietnam War protests were followed in the 80s by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which were massive demonstrations against nuclear weapons, and then the 1991 protest. But from 91 until 2003, they could claim the Vietnam syndrome was over. But as you've said, Iraq became another Vietnam. We just in our last segment talked about ISIS, which grew out of that invasion by the US in 2003. So the protest movement came back, and now it's disappeared again from 2003. So let's talk about today, Brian.
Yeah.
What is the state of the anti-war movement now? And there's no lack of wars to protest, I have to say.
But there's a difference now, which is that the United States is not sending large numbers of troops anywhere to fight big land battles. And they can't really do it. If Trump were to say, hey, we're going to send 100,000 troops to Syria, he will not get elected. This goes back to the issue, is the Vietnam syndrome actually truly gone? And the answer is no. We now could call it the Iraq War syndrome because it has a lasting impact and it is a constraint on US policymakers. So what they're doing is resorting to limited asymmetrical and low intensity conflict is to enforce US imperial designs. The use of drones are super important because, you know, in the last year of the Obama administration, I think Medea Benjamin from Code Pink and maybe one or two others did a study of how many bombs had been dropped in 2016. And the number was by America, and the number was like 27,000. I mean, it was like a mind-blowing number. I can't remember what the methodology was for it. But, you know, if you asked Americans, did the US go to war and drop 27,000 bombs in 2016? If you ask Americans then, they would say, no, we're not at war. Because the wars that the empire are waging are designed so that all the bleeding is somewhere else. All the suffering is on the other side. And you can use targeted assassinations through drone technology, or commandos and special operations in villages in Yemen, or working in coordination with Saudi bombers to bomb the hell out of Yemeni villages. And Americans don't know it. So the reason the anti-war movement is in eclipse is because of the new war fighting strategy of imperialism is designed principally to prevent the maturation of an anti-war movement, which would obviously become a factor in the calculations of policymakers. So there's a big constraint on the empire because the Vietnam or Iraq War syndrome is not dead, but that doesn't mean that they can't use other weapons and other technologies and other tactics that have the use of violence to affect American policy goals.
So do you see the future of warfare continuing down this road? I mean, they're now creating war robots where AI, or artificial intelligence, will take the place of soldiers. Will we ever return the U.S. to the large-scale land invasion? Now, between 73, the end of the Vietnam War, and 91, that was a long period during the Vietnam syndrome. That's almost 20 years. Now, we're coming up to almost 20 years in 2023, let's say 4 years from now, 20 years after the Iraq invasion. So you might calculate, well, then they could try to overcome the Iraq War syndrome. But if the warfare of the U.S. Continues down this technological road, we may never see that kind of major invasion again, and therefore they will have neutralized anti-war movement, you're saying?
Well, it depends. It depends who the adversary is, right? Like, it's not just drone technology. Like, I was in Answer Coalition. I'm the director of the Answer Coalition. We were very involved in trying to build anti-war sentiment during the Libya war. Now, that started March 19th, 2011, the same day that the Iraq war started. Our demonstrations were in the hundreds, not the thousands. And we worked just as hard. We worked day and night. We organized speaking tours. We did everything in our power and, had a very meager outcome, even though the US was not using drone technology, very dramatically, openly bombing the heck out of Libya. Again, it was Obama and Hillary Clinton who were the leadership. And the Democratic Party base, which if it had been a Republican, maybe if it was Trump, maybe they would have been out in force, but they certainly didn't come out. It reminded me of I did organize and helped organize protests against the Yugoslav war, which was Bill Clinton and the European Social Democrats' war against the last remaining socialist government in Europe. The only people who came to our demonstrations essentially were Serb Americans whose families were being targeted. They were big, but that's who it was. So yeah, if the enemy is Yugoslavia, the U.S. can bomb and bomb and bomb, and maybe there won't be a massive protest. If the enemy is Libya, the U.S. can carry out an air war and succeed, and then deprive allow the American people not to be directly engaged, not to send their sons and daughters to be killed. Then there won't be a big anti-war movement. But let's say the adversary isn't Libya, and it's not Yugoslavia. It's not a basically small country. Then the issue of war and peace and the involvement of the masses of people will be tested. The new military doctrine is for conflict with Russia and China. That's more like planning for World War III rather than Vietnam or Iraq or Libya or Yugoslavia. And you have to ask yourself, are they serious? I mean, are they actually thinking that there's going to be a war with China and Russia? I mean, Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons. You mentioned artificial intelligence. With all the U.S. is abrogating all of the arms treaty architecture of the Cold War. So the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ended in 2002, 2003. This last year, the Trump administration pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Range Treaty that was set by Reagan and Gorbachev that brought the intermediate range missiles out of Europe, that the same things that had provoked that big anti-nuclear movement in Europe in the 1980s. There's the START Treaty, the last arms treaty arrangement, START, which is a limitation on new nuclear weapons, that treaty, the old START treaty, is set to expire, I believe, in 2021 or 2022. There's not even negotiations underway, none. That means that will end. That means the equilibrium, if you can call it, the managed equilibrium or the managed rivalry between the thermonuclear states that was created as a consequence of the Cold War and the success in the Soviet Union achieving a rough parity with the United States, that architecture of equilibrium is being scuttled deliberately by the American government and the Pentagon. And you can see that their goal is to gain military supremacy. The only reason they signed those treaties in the first place, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty or all these other treaties, was they no longer believed they could gain military supremacy such that they could use those technologies and systems, so better to cap it and freeze it. Now they believe that they can get military supremacy over Russia and over China, and their focus is the militarization of outer space, and that's the new high ground. And the military doctrine that was announced is getting us all ready for conflict with Russia and China. To me, Joe, this poses the most important issue of all for the anti-war movement, because all the people who think, hey, we hate Vladimir Putin, Russia's interfering in our elections, Russia's the evil empire is returning, or China is our existential enemy. All the people who are echoing these sentiments are actually being manipulated into or have allowed themselves by the virtue of deception and self-deception to become the human material supporting the possibility, the prospect of global war with powers who are powerful enough that such a war would actually, we wouldn't even have to wait for climate change to wipe out the species. I mean, it's hard for people to really wrap their head around what the magnitude is of the destructive power that is possessed by the United States, Russia, and China. And minus those treaties, minus the architecture for equilibrium, this becomes an unmanaged rivalry. It will become an unmanaged rivalry. And that's what the era before World War I looked like. The unmanaged rivalry by great powers before World War I and World War II led to something that was inconceivable 20 years before World War I. I think only Frederick Engels wrote sort of in a visionary way in the 1890s. He was envisioning how the whole world could go to war against itself. And I think people thought of him as sort of kind of a nut. But he laid out the economic and political driving forces that would lead to something like that. I think that's where I believe that's where we're headed. And so that's a big issue for, quote, the anti-war movement.
If there were demonstrable signs that such a war with either China or Russia was on the cards, do you think that would bring the same numbers of people out into the street? I would think it would, and maybe even more than we saw in the Gulf before the.
That's right. I agree. That's one of the things that I think is very, very important is to not lose, like, you know, when you talk about World War III, it's kind of like a pessimistic, you know, how can you avoid the sort of a doom and gloom sort of thought, which is the opposite of what might be necessary to stop such an occurrence from happening. I mean, the American people, I think, confronted with the idea that there actually could be a war with Russia and China, would at first be paralyzed by fear. You're old enough, Joe, to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, I believe. You were probably young.
Well, I went under my desk in the first grade to protect myself. So that's my memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was 6 years old.
Okay. So, okay, now I know that I think I knew this before, but now I know that I'm actually older than you. And I'm 4 years older than you because I was 10. So when you're 10, unlike when you're 6, you're aware enough to know, like, big picture, everybody, all the adults are talking about the possibility of nuclear war. So we were all frightened. I mean, the American people were frightened, so frightened that nobody did anything. It was paralysis. It was paralysis because it came on suddenly. And suddenly, like, Russia had nuclear weapons in Cuba. We had to stop them. We were going to call their bluff if they didn't blink, if they didn't back down. Luckily, Khrushchev did back down because I think Kennedy made it quite clear that he felt the Pentagon were crazy. He, in his discussions with his brother, Robert Kennedy, he said, these people are crazy. Like, they were actually ready to go. They were actually ready to have a nuclear war rather than continued negotiations. And anybody watching, go watch the movie Dr. Strangelove to get a true sense of what the thing was like. Because Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick's great movie, captures the spirit of what the missile crisis with Cuba was, the October 1962 crisis. But my point is, if it's an emergency that suddenly arises, there will be paralysis. But if you can kind of see it coming, if you can kind of identify this as a down the road kind of event, it gives you enough time to actually start to mobilize a sanity, a sane public opinion that would say, no, 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 this is crazy. We cannot let the generals and the elites, all of whom will have their bunkers ready in the event of global war so that they themselves will not perish. We can't let them play with this. But I really think that's what's happening. The US is creating a global network of confrontation in the South China Sea, along Russia's borders. I think the Ukraine putsch in February 2014 was part of it. The setting up the missile defense shields in Romania and Poland, all of which are, again, minus Cold War arms treaty architecture, are really designed for first strike military supremacy and a dominant position in outer space. The goal of the Pentagon is not actually to go to war with Russia and China. They don't want a war with Russia and China. They're well aware of the dangers of what a conflict would look like. But I think they believe if they can achieve supremacy over Russia and China, then that's the ultimate bargaining chip to force countries to back down. And one last thought on this, Joe, is that and I know you're old enough to remember this, Reagan, when he came into office, doubled the military budget, went on a massive anti-Soviet crusade. The Committee on a Present Danger, all those retired generals and admirals leading the way. They had an alliance with China at the time, so it made the Soviet Union feel additionally isolated. The introduction of what was called Star Wars, strategic defense initiatives, scared the hell out of the Russians. They really felt the U.S. was they felt Reagan was crazy and the people around him were crazy, and they were going to go to war. And I think that a section within the Soviet Communist Party came to the conclusion that we should find a way to appease American power to diminish the threat of war. And so Gorbachev and Yeltsin and Shevardnadze and that whole crew, they came to the conclusion, let's give Eastern Europe back to the Western powers. Let's give them East Germany. Let's give them Poland and Bulgaria and Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Let's give them those back. And then they will see that we're really peaceful and they'll treat us the way they're treating China. They'll allow foreign direct investment into Russia. They'll allow technology transfer to happen. There was that fear that the Soviet Union was isolated by the war dangers from the Reagan administration, and it was losing out on technology because of the high-tech revolution. Computer revolution was happening at that time. And I think the eventual implosion of the Soviet Union, the second biggest power in the world, suddenly disappeared because of an internal crisis. Their internal crisis did what Hitler couldn't do, which was to wipe out Soviet power. I think the big takeaway for the Pentagon and all of the sort of militarist politicians in Washington is that if you put maximum pressure on countries, eventually those countries implode. So that's why they're doing it to Iran, maximum pressure on Venezuela. And I think the Pentagon is assuming that the identification of global war or major power conflict is a way of putting maximum pressure on China and on Russia, the goal of which is not war, the goal of which is to carry out regime change, like happened in the Soviet Union, where Russia, post-Putin perhaps, implodes politically, or the Chinese Communist Party divides into factions, as the Soviet Communist Party did in the face of a growing threat from the West. But when you put all that together, you can't have a more dangerous strategy, because the goal might not be war, but when you play chicken, nuclear chicken, over and over again all over the world, even by blunder, wars can happen.
Yes, and ironically, because there's some rudimentary democracy still left in the United States, military and political leaders have to sell the war to the public. There's a long period, for example, before the invasion of Iraq, of giving reasons, WMD, etc., trying to build support. But in doing that, if they did that, if they really wanted to go to war with Russia, they would be tipping their hands and allowing an anti-war movement to develop, because they would see. That's what happened, I think, in the first Gulf War and the second one. The people knew that the U.S. was planning this war, and they looked damn serious about it. If the problem with a nuclear-armed Russia is, and if you look back, as you said, at the Cuban Missile Crisis, this kind of a crisis could suddenly occur. We're at the brink of nuclear annihilation. It doesn't have to be a U.S., and there will never probably ever be a U.S. invasion, ground invasion of Russia, even though they put NATO troops right up to the border against the promises they'd given to the Soviet leaders that if they allowed a unified Germany, they would not do that. They would not bring these countries into NATO. They have, and they've put troops on the border. It's interesting you say that the Soviets decided to give up those Eastern European countries to try to, and thinking the U.S. would react rationally. Of course, they miscalculated not only how the U.S. would react, but certainly it backfired by bringing down the Soviet Union ultimately as well, giving up those satellite countries. So I just wanted you to ask about this issue of, I want to ask you about this issue of the public support that would be needed and how that could spark public protests against any kind of move against Russia. And then the last part of my question, and the last question I'm going to ask you, is the role of the media in this. Because in the Vietnam War, at the beginning, the media was totally on board with this war. They promoted it. Even Walter Cronkite, who then later became a pinata for the Pentagon because he came out against the war. But I believe that the people on the streets pushed the media in that direction, and Congress, against the war. I don't see that happening now. I don't see an anti-war movement, even a huge one on the scale of Vietnam, would influence that easily a press that is so Russophobic. And that's why this is so dangerous, this Russiagate story, because the press, I don't think, would do what they did in Vietnam, which was to turn against the U.S. militarists as they did. What do you think about that, Brian?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you can't, like the presentation about Russia in the media and the one that is creating all this animus and hostility towards Russia. It's not, look, we have to maybe go to war against Russia. If they talk like that, people would be like, what the hell are you talking about, go to war with Russia? Instead, they're like, Russia is victimizing us. We are the victims of Russia. We have Donald Trump because of Russia. I mean, how can you be more victimized than having somebody like Donald Trump as your leader? If Russia is responsible, then they're really, really bad. And all those resistance protests which I was going to, along with the Answer Coalition at the beginning of the anti-Trump movement when he took office, or actually when he won. At first, it was all very progressive, but by January and February, it started like all these Putin signs, anti-Putin signs, as if Trump was imposed on us by Putin. So the media has played this clever game, actually, by convincing progressive liberal Americans, the people who were the biggest vocal minority demanding peace with the Soviet Union, who are now like, no, Russia is bad. Russia is demonic. Russia is led by evil leaders. And Putin appears to them to be as evil as the Soviet leaders, but even more evil in a way, because the liberals, at least during the Cold War, said, look, Soviet Union's bad, communism, evil, but nonetheless, in the interest of peace, we should have cultural exchanges, we should meet with their leaders, we should have summits, you know. And now if the president of the United States meets with Putin, it's like, what secrets did he give up? How did Putin take advantage of our poor, helpless president of the United States? So it's the vehicle for propaganda has shifted. It's now not like Russia is on the march, Soviet Union was on the march in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and Africa. It's now Russia is actually targeting us, the American people, and people believe it. It's profoundly believed. So if you ask people, hey, do you think Putin is interfering in the American elections? Does Russia, do we have to guard ourselves against Russia? A lot of liberals will say, yes, absolutely. Did they use Facebook media and social media to turn the election? Yes. If you ask the same people, look, do you want to have a war with Russia? Those people would say, no, of course not. That's ridiculous. So the issue isn't being presented war or peace. What's happening is we are the victims of Russia, and there's a demonization of Russia, Russians. You know, it's kind of like and I don't think the liberals, they can't put two and two together, that this is actually an operation by the national security state and the capitalist-owned media, which is tied in with the security state, to create animus and hostility against a targeted entity, Russia. So I think there's kind of a bigotry now and a prejudice. If I raise these questions with people I know, if I go to a party and I'm in Washington, so some of my friends might be there, but there might be liberal Democrats there too, and you talk to them like this, they're like, it's almost like they can't hear, like somebody put giant plugs in their ears and they can't hear it, because the demonization campaign has been so effective. And again, it's separated from the issue of war and peace. So I think we have a real problem right now. We have a real problem because of the media. And you know, as you know, Joe, I do a show on Radio Sputnik. I do a 2-hour show with John Kiriakou. When I tell people I work for Radio Sputnik, and they know what I do, they know I'm the same person I've been for the last 50 years. I'm organizing against war and racism and empire, and like nothing's changed. They're like, oh my God, how could you be working for the Russians? Well, obviously, I wouldn't, if my show lacked independence, I wouldn't do it. If I was being told what to say, I wouldn't do that. But because John and my show is on Radio Sputnik, it's automatically in the minds of these people, like, you can't listen to it. So it's a kind of prejudice or bigotry that's developed that's very profound.
Your positions pre-existed the Russian Federation, let alone Sputnik or RT. So there, Sputnik is agreeing with you, basically, and you're fortunate to have a platform at all. And that's the real issue. The mainstream media will not allow voices like yours to be heard. So, Brian, I wanted to thank you for joining us. To sum up, the anti-war movement is being neutralized by the technology being used in wars, that there's not the existence of a large-scale invasion anymore that we're seeing, even though America's involved in more wars now than they probably have ever been, but none of them are on the scale of Vietnam or even the first and second Gulf Wars, which indeed spurred those protests.
But just to add the final point there, but because if you think of what the war machine is resorting to, these more limited warfare technologies, they're doing it because they fear the anti-war, the latent but real anti-war sentiment that exists in the population. and that functions as a constraint on the empire. So, yeah, if the U.S. were to, I met with the Iranian President Ahmadinejad in 2000, I don't know, 9 or 10. It was some event around the General Assembly of the UN. And he said, oh, our assessment is the US won't be able to go to war for at least another 10 years. And what he was basically suggesting is that Iran had some sort of freedom of action because the US couldn't go to war again because the anti-war sentiment around Iraq was so deep and profound. I think a lot of countries recognize that there is a limitation on American power now. And the limitation isn't because they don't have enough weapons. They have plenty of them. It's not because they don't have enough nuclear weapons. They have lots of them. The limitation is because of public opinion in America. And so the anti-war movement has to, even though it goes through ebbs and flows, it goes up and down, we have to keep going, and we are keeping going. We're working tirelessly to keep educating every person we can talk to about the real danger of war, where it comes from, the prospects of bigger and even more dangerous wars. And so, again, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. I think public opinion still exists, that it operates as a constraint, and that public opinion is profoundly anti-war.
So even if they're not out in the street massively, they're exercising an influence over U.S. policy.
Indeed.
And that's quite interesting. Brian Becker is our guest today. He was joining us from Washington. He's the host of Sputnik's radio show in the afternoon, Loud and Clear, and he's also the leader of the Answer Coalition. And we thank him for joining us on CN Live. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.